So we looked at the cities from the Age of Disunion. Now this lecture, we will focus on the individual architecture from the so-called Age of Disunion. And we will focus on the theme of cultural exchange, Sinicization, and architecture. So we looked at this map, so I'm not going to spend too much words. This is the map from the Three Kingdoms period and the Western Jin period. And after that, the north was broken into the so-called 16 kingdoms. And in the south, the Eastern Jin court moved to the city of Jiankang, which is in today's Nanjing. And then after that, North China temporarily unified the Yellow River, and the south broke up into other, two kingdoms, and the south experienced the successive change from the Southern Song, Southern Qi, Liang, and Chen dynasties until the unification under the Sui dynasty. So during this period, the greatest event was the introduction of Buddhism into China. So Buddhism originated in the Ganges River area of India. And around the 1st century, by the 1st century, Buddhism was spread to the north into Central Asia and to the south in Sri Lanka, which is known also as Ceylon. So it was from Central Asia that Buddhism was introduced to China through the ancient Silk Road, right? The Silk Road developed during the Han Dynasty developed during the Western Han period, which was from 202 BCE to 8 CE. By the time of the Eastern Han period, which is from the year 25 to the year 220, the Silk Road was already primarily a trade route. So instead of military function, it served as the trade route for the merchant to travel in and out of China. So those merchants were of different religious background. Some of them were Buddhists. So there were, Indian merchant, the Persian merchant, and even Roman. So some of the came from many different religious backgrounds, and as a result, religion was also exchanged and spread along the Silk Road. So Buddhism was introduced basically following the same trade route to enter China. So the earliest Buddhist sites are located on the Western area. So move further and further to the Eastern area. And so the first introduction of Buddhism was in the 1st century CE, but during the entire Eastern Han period, Buddhism remained practiced by a very small group of elite. It was during the Age of Disunion, and especially under the state sponsorship of the Northern Wei court, that Buddhism was popularized in North China. And Buddhism was also kind of popularized in South China as well during the Song Dynasty, especially under the the Liang dynasty. So there was a small branch of Southern Buddhism introduced to southwestern part of China via the southern diffusion, or the southern kind of spreading, and that was the Theravada tradition. So there are three major schools of Buddhism, and we will look at this in more detail later. The Mahayana, the Theravada, and the Vajrayana. The Mahayana is the main kind of Buddhist school. It's like the Sunni in Islam, that is the majority. And that is what the northern spreading, kind of the main form of northern spreading, called the Mahayana. And the southern spreading, known as the Theravada, was primarily influential in Southeast Asia and in southwest part of China. The Trans-Himalaya diffusion of Buddhism introduced the Vajrayana to China, and that is the tantric tradition. So we will look at these in more detail in the future. So here, I think the important concept to establish is one, during the Age of Disunion, in the 3rd century to 6th century, Buddhism was introduced and popularized in China. And from China, Buddhism was introduced to Korea and Japan. That was in the 4th century and the 5th century, respectively. So Buddhism in India had developed types of religious architecture. So these are Indian architecture. One is called a stupa. Stupa features a hemispherical mound. Stupa was to bury the relics of Buddha, according to the Buddhist belief. When historic Buddha, that is the Shakyamuni Buddha, passed into nirvana, which is the Buddhist way of referring to death, the cremation of his body created tens of thousands of relics in the form of shining jewel. And those were distributed to different parts of the world to be honored with a tomb-like structure called a stupa. So it's basically a relics architecture. It's a kind of a memorial structure, but having that kind of tomb-like figure, tomb-like feature in India. A second type of building is called chaitya. Chaitya is a worshiping space. It features a long kind of axial hall featuring a stupa at the end as the kind of worshiping center, like the altar in a Christian church. So it is at the end of the hall, and it was meant for circumambulation. So people worship the relics of Buddha by walking and chanting around it. And there were also aisles on the side. So there's a nave and aisle and a central taller hall, and the side narrower and lower kind of passageway. So this is chaitya is a worshiping space. And there is also a building type called a vihara, which you can see like this one, that one. And in plan, it looks like a square building with a central courtyard surrounded by smaller rooms. So this is a rock cut site at Ajanta they are caves, but they are mimicking the spatial feature of those, standing building on ground. So vihara is basically the dormitory for the monks and Buddhist practitioners. So these are the three major types of Buddhist architecture in India. When they were introduced to China, the Chinese building construction intervened and create a hybrid, and eventually became characteristic East Asian type of Buddhist architecture. The oldest Buddhist architecture, if we do not count the cave, is the Songyue Si Pagoda in Henan province. The pagoda located in the Songyue monastery. So you should know in this class, the word Si, S-I, means monastery or temple. So this is the Songyue monastery or Songyue Si Pagoda. This is the oldest, quote unquote, standing architecture in China. And it was from the 6th century, from the Wei period. And it was also repaired in the 8th century during Tang Dynasty, but the early character of Buddhist architecture was preserved there. So pagoda, the East Asian pagoda, pagoda is a East Asian version of stupa. So the function for pagoda was also to honor the Buddhist relics. And in China, not only the relics from Buddha were honored, but also those great Buddhist masters, the great monks. After the path to nirvana, the cremation of their body, if the cremation of their bodies produce kind of shining stone, and that was considered as a proof of achieving the status of an enlightened one, and their relics would be honored with a pagoda. A pagoda would be built to bury the relics underneath. So Songyue Si Pagoda is an early pagoda. It is the Chinese countertype to the Indian stupa. So there are many different types of pagoda in China, and the Songyue Si Pagoda was called the Miyan-ta type, right? And the Chinese word ta, T-A, means pagoda. That's the Chinese word for pagoda. And then Miyan means dense eve, which refer to the densely populated roofs or eaves on the upper part of the vertical pagoda. So it's called dense eve pagoda. The eaves are very close to one another, and the floor height was small. So it created that density in the layering of the eaves. So it's called a Miyan-ta, the dense eve pagoda. The Songyue Si Pagoda was an early type because it does not have much features of the traditional Chinese wooden structure. It looks very masonry. There was no attempt to mimic the wooden frame in the carving and surface decoration of the pagoda. And also there are characteristic decorative motifs that were directly copied from India. For example, there were a lot of line carving on the surface of the wall, and those lines were carved in the same way as the lines carved in India. And there were also characteristic window frame that looks very much like what was discovered in India during an earlier time. So this is the early kind of Chinese pagoda. The lower part of the pagoda is much higher in the floor height. And the lowermost section was pretty much undecorated. Scholars believe that it might be used to be surrounded by a wooden roof on the lower level and surrounded by a wooden corridor and supporting a sloping roof. That might be the case, because otherwise the lower part, which is most visible for the entire building, should be the most elaborately decorated. The very reason it was not decorated might be because it used to be inside a surrounding wooden corridor. And after more than 1500 years, those wooden corridor disappeared, and the blank lower walls were exposed. So another type of Chinese pagoda is called a 单层塔. 单层 simply means one story. It referred to the pagoda type in China that was probably preserved, the earliest model of Chinese pagoda, and it is also the closest to the Indian stupa. But this kind of pagoda was no longer very popular in China in the later imperial period, but they survived in a lot of Buddhist murals in Buddhist caves from Dunhuang, for example. And you can see from those images, they look very close to the Indian stupa. Some of them still had the hemisphere body. And some of them, this one was a 5th century small one-story pagoda. So 单层 means one story. And it has a kind of square plan instead of hemispherical. So that was already sinicized, called the sinicization of a foreign type. But the most popular type of Chinese pagoda today is called the 楼阁式塔. 楼阁式塔. 楼阁 means tower pavilion. And this is the fully sinicized kind of Chinese pagoda because it was constructed in wood. At first combined with rammed earth platform, but later with pure wooden structure. Basically, it's like the piling up of a series of pavilions to create a tower. So 楼阁 simply means, tower pavilion or, tower. So in the 楼阁式塔, 楼阁 style Chinese pagoda, the Chinese feature was in full bloom. There was no kind of masonry feature anymore. The connection to the Indian prototype is not as strong as the previous two types of Chinese pagoda. And many scholars believe the 楼阁式塔, 楼阁 pavilion, the 楼阁 style pagoda was a combination of Buddhist function with the traditional Chinese wooden tower from the Han Dynasty. So in the Han Dynasty, some tomb models that features watchtower, and some scholars believe these are immortal towers associated with the Taoist belief in immortal. And some scholars believe they were more of kind of practical purposes for defense, which were constructed in wood, featuring those brackets. And And indeed, you know, when Buddhism was introduced to China, there was no reason not to take the technology, material the Chinese craftsmen were comfortable for the construction of Buddhist architecture. So this would be the main kind of pagoda type that we are going to look at in the future, as well as the Miyan-ta. So Miyan-ta were also constructed, and it's significant primarily because a lot of Miyan-shi pagoda were constructed in masonry structure, in bricks, with bricks and stone. So these survived in larger scale. And even some of the Loge Shita, Loge style pagoda were also built in stone and bricks, but the bear looking, bear the appearance of wooden structure like this one. Well, this one is a real wooden structure. So that's something we will look at in the following slides, as well as successive lectures for future dynasties. So we will stop today's lecture